Well, it's a great pleasure to see you all here today on such a cold evening, and I welcome you to the University of Canberra. For some of you that don't know me, I'm Rachel David. I'm Director for the Centre for Research and Action in Public Health here at the University, and it's with great pleasure that we are presenting this seminar, which is co-sponsored by the Dietetics Association of Australia and the Murray-Darling Basin CRM, which is the Collaborative Research Network, and the director, Peter O'Brien, I see over there. We're really pleased to present this seminar with those joint partners, because it gives an idea of the types of multidisciplinary research that we do at the University of Canberra. Certainly with the Collaborative Research Network, we are really looking across interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary approaches to solving some of Australia's wicked problems in a very effective way. So it's a great pleasure that we've joined together here to present this seminar, which has common research themes that go right across public health, social and economic health as well. So before I go much further, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, who are the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today, and I extend that respect to elders, both past and present, and to any Indigenous people present here today. I'm going to pass over to Gabrielle O'Kane in our Dietetics and Nutrition department at the university to introduce our guest speaker, because she knows Jennifer better than I do. I didn't make the bike ride around the lake, I'm afraid. So I'll now hand over to Gabrielle O'Kane to introduce our speaker for tonight.
Thanks, Rachel. Dr. Jennifer Wilkins' work focuses on how food and agricultural systems impacts on public health, environmental sustainability and community wellbeing. She's a registered dietitian and has a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Studies and a Master of Nutrition Education, and her PhD is in the area of nutrition and consumer economics. Shortly after joining the Cornell faculty, Jennifer conceptualised and developed the first regional food guide in the United States, and it's called the Northeast Regional Food Guide. This food guide promotes health, sustainability and local food systems. In 2010, Dr. Wilkins became the community coordinator for the Cornell Dietetic Internship Program. And since the early 2000s, she's directed the Cornell Farm to School Program and the Cornell Farmers Markets Nutrition Outreach Program, in partnership with the New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets and the New York State Department of Health. So would you please welcome Jennifer Wilkins.
Good evening. It's really a delight to be here, and I'm seeing some familiar faces in a place that I've just arrived a week ago. And it's wonderful to be here in Australia, and it's wonderful to be here in Canberra. And I've had a lovely time, and I'm realizing that I'm actually going to be just a little bit heartbroken in a couple days when I have to leave, because I've become somewhat attached to the place. And I've also been able to see a bit of your city. It's lovely, and walk a bit. I've actually seen Lake Griffin on bicycle the other morning, which was lovely. And I've also been able to see some of your wonderful landscape on horseback, which I hadn't been on horseback probably for I don't know how many decades. So that was a real treat. And I would also like to take a moment to thank the various entities that have made it possible for me to be here. First, the Dietetic Association of Australia was kind enough to invite me to speak at their conference in the first place, and that's what brought me over here. And then I was able to extend for this week with the kind support of the Research Center, the Center for Research and Action in Public Health, and the Murray-Darling Basin Future Collaborative Network. So I would like to thank those entities as well. And also support from the UC Distinguished Visitor Program, particularly the Deputy Vice Chancellor for Research, Professor Francis Shannon, and Professor Lauren Williams for making this happen. So what I'd like to do in my moments with you is to share some of my reflections on local food, on food systems, and some of the questions that have been raised, and I think that there's a really lively debate and some really interesting and important questions are being asked now about the role of food, the role of food system change in not only enhancing public health, but in assuring sustainability. As I hope to show, local food systems will undoubtedly, I believe, be part of the transition to planetary sustainability, but this strategy will need to be coupled with other very, very important and significant actions, decisions, and policies at all levels. So this cover was actually from 2007, and you're going to see another Time magazine cover. I realize I don't work for Time magazine, but they convey some really important changes and societal kind of interests. So this cover is from 2007 and reflects local, quite definitively overtaking organic as a prime concern among consumers. And then even before that, the Hartman Consumer Research Group, which is based in Bellevue, Washington, near Seattle, did a study and found that locally grown was more of an influence on consumer food choices, and in fact, influenced 55% of consumers in their food choices, versus organically grown, which influenced 38% of consumers who responded to their survey. So the explosion in interest in local food has also ushered in a new vocabulary. We now have locavores, which is meant to mean people who endeavor to consume most of their diet from some sort of distance from where they live, either 100-mile, you've maybe heard of the 100-mile diet, that's another way of naming it. And also we have this notion of decreasing the distance between food production and food consumption makes us conscious of how many food miles we may be consuming. Another term that's associated with this local food movement, and it's adding to our vocabulary. And I'm not going to be talking all night about food miles, but I think it is important, and it also offers us a chance to explore some related questions that I think are really important. So there are also motivations and meanings that are very much involved with this interest in local food, and people, when you think about how do people define local food, well, there is definitely a distance kind of definition. Produced within my county, produced within my state, produced within 100 miles. But it has a much deeper meaning. And there's a connection to place when people think about local food and local food systems. There's a healthier lifestyle and a way for consumers to indulge in gourmet food experiences, really having that much more sensuous experience with food. It's fresher, higher quality. Local also means to people that it's grown with fewer pesticides. The Hartman Group also found that when people think of local, they think of more authentic, food that is more authentic than mass-produced food. It also means relationships between different stakeholders in the food systems, and has a more important and palatable story associated with it, if you will. And this is a magazine cover from these series of magazines called Edibles. There's Edible Cleveland, there's Edible New York, there's Edible, and this is my region where I'm from, Edible Finger Lakes of New York State. And they have exploded across the country, which really is another indication that this has really taken hold and that there's a lot of interest in consuming locally. Another thing that I think is really driving this interest in local, and I think it's something that you're all really involved with and concerned about, is this notion of the true cost of food. And what I really like is how Jules Preddy has put this. We really pay for food 3 times. We pay for food at the supermarket till, of course. We pay for it also in public health and environmental costs. And we also pay for it in terms of agricultural subsidies. And I know our system in the U.S. is far different than here in Australia in terms of how agriculture is subsidized. But taxpayers in the U.S. pay a lot to support a system that many would say is not entirely supporting public health or the environment. So in terms of costs, we're paying a lot and will continue to pay a hefty price for increasing and yet avoidable incidence of diet-related chronic diseases. It's estimated in the U.S. that 3/4 of the healthcare spending, increase in healthcare spending, is related to preventable disease. And obesity accounts for a major portion of these healthcare costs. Globally, increasingly globally, what in the U.S. we're leading in terms of how much we're paying for for obesity-related healthcare costs, and definitely leading relative to how much Canada and Australia are paying for obesity-related healthcare costs. So a clear lesson that we should be learning from this reality is that the food system needs to change. Global forces have been at play for decades now to keep prices low and actually keep food prices low, but it's actually commodity prices that are kept low. There's a lot of money being made in food, but it's mostly in what happens from when commodities are harvested to when they're converted into a product that's sold at the supermarket. So this cheap food policy will likely continue, as Michael Pollan stated in an op-ed that was in the New York Times in 2009, as long as the social and environmental costs are charged to the future. And we may well look, I believe, eventually to the health insurers for support for radical food system change, as they surely have a financial interest in reducing diet-related chronic diseases, because they're paying a lot for them. So when we look at the food system and ask, well, what are the goals of the food system? Certainly, those of us involved in health want health to be one of those goals and those outcomes of the food system. But increasingly, there are other measures of success or a successful food system, and these are becoming increasingly salient. And the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, which supports a lot of community food system kinds of work, has come up with a term called good food. And they have defined it as food that is green, so meaning it has some sort of an environmental aspect to it, that it's not damaging to the environment, that it's clean, it's safe, it's free of contaminants, and it doesn't contain foodborne illness or cause foodborne illnesses, that it's fair. There's a sense of, or an aspect to food, good food, that is about dignity, that is about justice and equity, and also that it's affordable. So this has to do with access to very good, healthy food. And in the United States, there are several areas in inner cities and in rural areas that really lack good access to healthy food. So I really like this graphic because it puts health and sustainability at the center as the core mission of the food system. And this was adapted from an image that was produced by Gail Feenstra, a good colleague and friend of mine out in California at UC Davis. And it really is a contrast to production and output being the main driver and the main goal of the food system. And it's defined as a community food system where sustainable food production, processing, distribution, and consumption are integrated to enhance the environmental, economic, social, and nutritional health of a particular geographic location. And you can think for yourself, if you were to think about that geographic location, maybe you would think about the ACT or maybe a wider area, but that geographic location could be a city, it could be we would say counties in the U.S., it could be a state, or it could be a region that might, in the States, include several states, but here would probably just be one state since your states are so vast. And the word community in community food system is really at the core of what I think is a very important contrast to the dominant food system that we have, because it's about relationships, and it emphasizes that relationships between stakeholders throughout the food system. And what we've seen is a growth in elements of or representations of community-based food systems that are locally owned and controlled, environmentally sound, and health promoting. Farmers markets, I had the great pleasure with Gabrielle over the weekend, last weekend, to visit the farmers market here, and it was quite delightful. I'm still enjoying the apples that I bought there. Community-supported agriculture farms, and have any of you ever belonged to a CSA? No hands go. Oh yes, okay, one person. In the U.S., okay. Anybody here? Anybody heard of them here or know of them? Okay, so there's some awareness. It's something that I gather is very new here in Australia, but interest is definitely growing. Community and school gardens are another aspect of community-based food systems, and earlier this week I had the great pleasure of being involved in an event that was organized to spearhead and get off the ground, well, get in the ground, I guess, the UC High School at Kaleen Super Garden. So be looking for that. I think it's going to be a wonderful initiative that's going to be changing very much the capacity of the local food system here. Small-scale food processing is another aspect of community food systems, community kitchens, farm to cafeteria projects that involve schools, businesses, prisons, all sorts of institutions, hospitals, and also we have in the U.S. a number of different kinds of food assistance programs, and increasingly there is an awareness and concern that the food that is being delivered through those systems should also help local farmers and help and have some environmental component to them. So just kind of looking at the U.S., we've had a tremendous growth in the number of farmers markets since the Agriculture Marketing Services, which is part of the USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, started tracking the number in 1994. In fact, they used to track them every 2 years, and then I think it's in 2008 they started going every year because the increase was so great, and this number just keeps going up. I think at some point we're going to see a saturation of farmers markets, but we haven't seen it yet. And there's also been a recent and substantial growth in the number of farmers markets in Australia, and this is from your Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, where I learned that the first farmers market, at least in their records, was opened in 1999, and in the space of 14 years, you now have 150 in operation. And I really like how farmers market is defined on the DAF website, which is a predominantly fresh food market that operates regularly within a community at a focal public location that provides a suitable environment for farmers and food producers to sell farm origin and associated value-added processed foods directly to consumers. So I think that's a really nice definition. So community-supported agriculture, it's been said that the first originally came from Germany, Switzerland, and Japan in the 1960s. And it was started by a group of Japanese women who were concerned about the increase in food imports and the corresponding decrease in the farming population initiated a direct growth and growing interest in purchasing from farmers directly. So this notion of community or consumer-supported agriculture was born out of this concern. And they characterize it with this term teike, which really means putting a farmer's face on the food, which if you think about most of the food that we purchase in a supermarket, there's probably no human face associated with it. So I wanted now to take a look at some of the claims that are made about local food. And you probably are familiar with these, but we could categorize the types of claims that are made about local food in terms of health-related claims. It's more nutritious, it's better for you. Economic claims, There are taste claims, a whole range of different kind of claims. And one that I got a lot, or I've gotten a lot over the last 20 years because this is an area of interest of mine, is that local food is more nutritious and it's fresher. And you've seen these kind of quotes a lot, I'm sure. So the question is, well, what's the basis and where's the evidence for these kind of claims? And when you really start looking at this question, local food is more nutritious, you have to think, well, what are you really going to compare? So there's different ways of looking at it. I wanted to just share a few things. So determinants of quality. So there are, of course, just looking at any fresh food, any fresh fruits and vegetables, there are several factors that are involved in the nutritional quality and the freshness. So maturity at the stage of harvest will determine, to some extent, the nutritional quality, how it's handled at harvest during packing and shipping, whether the field heat is taken out of the fruit or vegetable immediately, and whether it's kept cool and at the right humidity during storage and shipping. So looking at this maturity issue, you can see here that the anthocyanins is one of the really important phytochemicals that has the potential to fight cancer, calm inflammation, lower cholesterol and blood pressure, and protect against aging brains. I'm really interested in that. And reduce the risk of obesity and diabetes and cardiovascular disease. So phytochemicals are really wonderful things, and we'd like to see more of them. So if food is allowed to reach its peak ripeness, then it's likely to have a higher level of these phytochemicals. So the question here is, looking at different systems, local versus conventional mass distribution, where are you likely to see the most crops that are allowed to ripen to their peak ripeness? That's a question. So another issue is varieties. What we see is in conventional systems, the conventional market really favors some traits over others. They favor traits of fast growth, of yield, and also shippability. So we like to have fruits and vegetables that will maintain their quality shipped over great distances. But what we find is that when some of those commercial traits are really enhanced in a product, in a crop, we lose out on some of the nutritional and taste aspects. So they don't always go together. And fruit and vegetable varieties differ not only in appearance and taste, but they will also vary in mineral, vitamin, and other phytochemical content. So think about the varieties that you might find in a supermarket. I had my little research project last night. I walked over to Woolworths just to see what your supermarkets were like. It's amazing. But think about if you've been to farmers markets and then you've been to a supermarket, you might remember seeing different varieties of, say, tomatoes, or different varieties of apples in either one of those locations. So the question here in terms of variety, I mean, as a nutritionist, we always say variety is one of the core principles of nutrition, but it's also varieties within any given group of food. And the more diversity and the more variety you have, the more likely you're going to get a full complement of the phytochemicals, the vitamins and minerals that we're still learning about. We're still discovering these components and how they affect health. So there was an op-ed that was just published in the New York Times, I think it was on Sunday, and this op-ed provides some interesting food for thought on the issue of varieties in terms of looking historically at what the kind of native or heirloom varieties of a number of different kinds of crops are. So what this author, his name's Joe Robinson, and he's going to be coming out with a book. The name of the op-ed, or the title of the op-ed, is Breeding the Nutrition Out of Our Food. And he looked at a number of different crops in terms of the kind of that crop that we currently see most of in our conventional markets, and then looked back historically at sort of the native or the heirloom variety. And what he found time and time again was that the older variety, the heirloom variety, had higher phytochemical content. So he looked at corn, he looked at apples, think about your apples, and look at the amazing difference in the amount of phytochemicals in these different varieties, and look at the names and see which ones are familiar to you. Now, I've heard of the ones on the bottom that hardly have any of them, but I don't think I've ever had any of the other ones, okay? So when we're thinking about local food systems, it's really important, I think, to start looking at native varieties, traditional foods, and to ask the question, is there a nutritional advantage, and do we still have the capacity in terms of soils and climate to produce some of those things? There may be a public health advantage. So some other examples, and this just made me sick when I saw this because I've been weeding in my garden and pulling out hundreds of dandelions and putting them in the compost. And I was thinking, boy, I just wasted a lot of nutrition there. But dandelions far outweigh in terms of the spinach, which is meant to be and is highly, we think, highly nutritious, but dandelion greens are much higher in phytochemicals. Just a couple more examples. Blueberries, you can see the wild aronia berries or chokeberry is much higher in phytochemicals. And carrots, now I have seen these purple carrots at farmers markets. I don't really see them in the supermarket. So you can see the big difference in these different kind of varieties. So, and that's one of the things I think is delightful and fun and exciting about going to the farmers market, is you're going to see things you don't ordinarily see. And it just so happens that it might be better to eat them. So last example is potatoes. And again, when I go to the farmers market, I'm likely to see some pretty strange looking potatoes, and they may actually be really good for me, okay? So, so I think it's important to think about varieties, what kinds of varieties are chosen for the conventional market, for big agriculture, and is there a difference between the varieties that your local farmer might choose after having conversations with customers, after learning more about what grows well right here, and there may be a real public health advantage. So another question that I think is really important, and I know that just from hearing people talk about carbon footprint in the week or so that I've been here, it's really in the forefront of everyone's head here, which is amazing. You don't hear that as much in the United States. So one of the questions is about, does local food really lower fuel use, and does it decrease greenhouse gas emissions? So you may have seen some of these analyses, but this was one of the first ones that was done in the United States out of the Leopold Center at Iowa State University, looking at the distance that food travels from different kinds of markets. So they looked at local markets, they looked at a regionally distributed market, and then a conventional national distribution. And they looked at a number of different fruits, vegetables, and other commodities as well. And this one just shows you the comparison between apples and spinach. You can see the comparison between the local market and the conventional. Big difference in the number of miles traveled. That's not really that much of a surprise. And then they also looked at the amount of fuel use. So there was 4 to 17 times more fuel in the Iowa-based regional and local than the local. And also in the conventional system, in terms of CO2 emissions, the conventional system released 5 to 17 times more than the regional and the local, respectively. So in terms of just how far the food travels to a market, supermarket, wherever it's going to be purchased, there's really little doubt that there is a lower carbon footprint in that process in terms of fuel use and CO2 emissions. But nothing is ever really that simple, and we have to consider how food is transported. If food is transported in small, less fuel-efficient trucks, then you're going to get more greenhouse gas emissions. And in terms of transporting large volumes of food, air is absolutely the least efficient, and it's more, then there's truck and then train, and then the most efficient is by container ship. And you know, some food companies have started getting into the game of trying to give consumers some sort of indication of carbon footprint. And this is one from the UK, Walker's Crisps, or we call them potato chips in the US. What do you call them here? Chips. So they've started trying to evaluate through the whole chain of making their chips, from the growing of the potatoes to the manufacturing of the crisps, packaging and distribution, to bring the potato chips, transportation to bring them to the stores, and then disposing of the empty packages. And you can see on this slide there that the one package of chips had 75 grams of carbon. So it's interesting to me that, you know, we're talking about what is the carbon footprint of potato chips when it's actually a product that we probably should not be eating so much of in the first place. So, which brings me to another sort of carbon, and I'm going to give you a new word, foodprint factors. It really depends on, you know, how often we shop, and how do we get to the store? Do we drive? Do we walk? How food is processed and packaged, and this is a big issue in terms of sustainability as well as public health, is how we transform food from a commodity into a packaged product. How food is stored, how we cook it, and how it is, how much we overeat. And that gets back to the potato chips. So the impact of overeating is actually quite important, both from a public health standpoint and from an environmental standpoint. And one of my colleagues at Cornell, Jeff Sobel, and a colleague at Penn State University, Dorothy Blair, did a study where they looked at what they call luxus consumption, and they define that as food that is consumed in excess, is wasted, either overconsumed or thrown away. And they then calculated how much land is required for that additional food that is either consumed in excess or wasted. And you can see the amount of land or fishing area that would be required to make up that food, as well as how much energy is consumed just for that food that's not really necessary to be consumed. So food wasting is actually one of the key strategies that we need to engage in terms of sustainability. Another claim made about local food systems is that it's good for the local economy. And there have been now several studies, this was one of the first that I know of, that came out of Michigan State, where they looked at the job-building potential of helping farms sell more fruits and vegetables into the fresh markets. And you can see the number of new jobs in their analyses that would be generated, and the amount of money in personal income that would be generated from a shift to more local sales of fruits and vegetables. And in another study, this one is out of Iowa State University, from the Leopold Center again, they looked at if people met more of their fruit and vegetable requirement or guideline from locally sourced produce, what that would mean in terms of economic output, and in terms of labor income, and in terms of jobs for the state. So you can see there, and I think that these are kind of interesting analyses to make. So you can, there have been other kinds of analyses, like what if everybody in Canberra spent $10 a week at the local farmers market? What would that mean in terms of income for your local agriculture? And it gets to be quite substantial. And this one I included as well. This is from British Columbia, Canada, where they looked at this notion of, well, okay, for the province of British Columbia, how much of the food needs are we actually meeting by production in the province? So these kind of analyses, I think, are important because they make us look at where we live and sort of our human carrying capacity of an area. And I know that you have so much area in Australia, so your carrying capacity is probably far from being reached. But it's important to start looking at this issue, and you can see the percentages of food that is met according to the current consumption patterns, but then if you look at the dietary guidelines or their nutrition advice in British Columbia, it drops to 34% when you look at what's produced there. So this slide looks at, in the US, and this was done by the USDA Economic Research Service, and asked the question, if everyone started following the dietary guidelines, if all of a sudden nutritionists were made redundant and not, well, redundant has a different meaning here, were no longer needed because everybody was following good nutrition advice, how much more land in each one of the food groups would be needed to meet that extra demand if it came from domestic production? So you can see that there's an increase of 4.1 million acres, and I know do you do acres here or hectares? Doesn't matter, okay. And almost 9 million acres would have to be increased for vegetables. So this is important too. If we're going to be advising better diets, then there's going to be probably a shift in what people eat if they follow them, and this is going to have implications for the land. So we also did a study looking at this for New York State, and you can see that the percentages of for New York State really vary quite a bit depending on this is just for vegetables, but in terms of dietary recommendations, the production in the state is only 10% for greens, and overall is only 38% of what people would require if they followed the dietary guidelines. So this notion of local food systems, I think it's important to think not only about building local food systems, but think about local food systems in the context of regional and national and global food systems, and ask what is the most appropriate source of any food, how much should come from a local source, how much should we rely on regional and distant sources. But this is a pretty striking quote from then Department of Health and Human Services Secretary Tommy Thompson, and he was really looking at the vulnerability of the food system because it's so concentrated and consolidated. And shortly after 9/11, our Farm Bureau in New York State came out with this poster and really related the two, Homeland Security with buying local food, which I thought was really interesting. So we have a number, no one can doubt, a number of very big challenges, and food seems to be at the center of a perfect storm in terms of these challenges. And food system change, I think, will be one of the things that's really required to meet these challenges. And just getting down to the bottom of the list, one is who controls the food system and who has most of the power in the food system. We see in the United States, and I'm sure it's the same here, increasing concentration, and this term concentration ratio has to do with the number of companies or industries that control the amount of a certain market. So a CR4 means that 4 beef packers control 81% of the market. So you can see that in a number of commodities, there's very, very few corporations that are controlling a large part of that market. And this happens not only in commodity production, but also in processing. 85% in the US, 85% of the vegetables are under contract, and manufactured food products, 10 companies are controlling most of that. So what we see is a real bottleneck in terms of having, you know, a wide number of different kinds of producers, but then very, very few processors, retailers, manufacturers, wholesalers, and then again a big number of consumers. And what local food systems does is it circumvents that, so you get a direct connection. And in terms of local consequences, I was actually hearing a bit about this happening here, and there was an article that was published yesterday or the day before on this website called The Conversation, and it was co-authored by Michael Santhanam, Martin, Jane Dixon, who is a name that I'm sure is familiar to many of you, Joanna Christensen. Article title was, "Are We Allowing Our Fruit Industry to Wither?" And what's happening is that more than half of the 150 current peach and pear suppliers were told none of their crop would be required in 2004 by the major processor. So this kind of consolidation is having really significant impacts here. So another threat that we are facing, I think, in the U.S. for sure, and probably here too, is urban sprawl, and how we design our cities is actually having a big effect on our food supply. And in the U.S., you can see that most of our fruits and vegetables and other commodities are being produced in what they call the path of development. And the land that they're growing on is under threat of urban sprawl. So just a couple more depressing slides. This is a book called The Long Emergency that really talks about peak oil. And peak oil is meant to be the point at which we have extracted half of all the oil that has ever existed in the world. And that is the half that is easiest to get, is most economically obtained, highest quality, and cheapest to refine. So think about any part of the food system that isn't reliant on oil. So this is going to be one of the big significant drivers of food system change. And just to quote him, the author in his book, he definitely says that most of our food is going to be locally grown and locally obtained. So the question is, you know, what kind of food systems are most likely to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, conserve and protect water resources, respect culture and ethnic diversity, increase citizen engagement, reduce energy use, stimulate local economies, improve health, enhance biodiversity, improve soil quality, and maximize the enjoyment of food. And that's what we need to strive for. And just one last image on this. So we will simply have to grow more of our food locally was the quote I wanted. And then this speaks to something very serious in terms of not only soil that we have here where we grow local food, but soil quality and soil fertility in places where we are dependent on food imports. So those are the questions that I read before. And one of the things we can do is to rethink dietary guidelines. And this is the food guide that Gabrielle mentioned before. And this was based on the national model, but the foods that are pictured here are foods that grow in the Northeast region. So it links health with local regional food systems. This is a model from the Barilla Center, which really links health and sustainability. Two pyramids here, one showing the foods that are the most healthful, and coincidentally, or not so coincidentally, a diet that is most healthful is also most sustainable. And from your own dietary guidelines, there's an Appendix G, which is, I think, a critical part of your dietary guidelines, which really shows the impacts and inputs and the consequences of each stage of your food system. So just to sort of end, I think we can take inspiration for local food systems and food systems change from a lot of different places. This is an image that I love because it's two of my favorite farmers at the farmers market, and you can see the joy that they have in selling their product directly to consumers. And these are the people that I go to for my carrots, because their carrots are to die for. More inspiration comes from the White House. This is Michelle Obama, and she directed taking out grass that is using fossil fuels to mow frequently and put in a garden. And her inspiration might have come from another time in the 1940s when there was actually food production on the grounds in front of the White House. And it's interesting, from this era, this wartime era, there were many values and principles that were articulated very clearly and represented in beautiful posters that are still available, and with the web you can find any of them. But these values of frugality and thrift and self-sufficiency were really promoted and strongly, strongly encouraged, and it wasn't anything to be ashamed of or embarrassed by, which I think is really important. And reliance and efficiency and capacity, more values. Conservation, regeneration, and renewal. Now this is interesting. This poster would not be made today because our world is very, very different. But the fact that they thought about what foods are available for free and just for capture versus conserving the land was an interesting notion. And self-reliance and sharing. Okay? Now, I know you have a lot of rabbits around here. How many restaurants are serving rabbit in Canberra? Okay, in my area, it's deer. We have a lot of deer. And so I would hope that eventually more and more restaurants are serving venison in my area, but not too many do. And then this one, which I think is amazing that these are here. Just read that list. It's from the 1940s. So we already have all of the guidelines that we need. The question is how and who and when they're going to be implemented. So just sort of as a final note, the word consumer, I think, is problematic. We're humans. And I think we need to really look at how we refer ourselves to consumers. We're more than consumers. Yeah, we do that. But maybe talking about ourselves as food citizens and changing the relationship that we have with food. So that's it. I'm going to take some questions.
Look, I thoroughly enjoyed your talk, but if you think about the US, it's just a corn soybean economy. It's a corn soybean economy. You know, you don't need that stuff. I mean, you're feeding corn and soybean to livestock at a tremendous waste of nutrients when you could be feeding something else to, you know, to humans. Just get rid of all that corn, get rid of all those soybeans. But the minute you're doing that, you're taking on Monsanto and these massive corporations that are deciding who's your president. So how are you going to break this down? How are you going to just turn this around and go back to the 1940s?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And what really strikes me is you have something like the Leopold Center that is fighting this battle from within Iowa, the center of corn and soybeans. And the other thing is that people have this notion that you can't grow anything but corn and soybeans in Iowa. That is totally not true. The soil is very fertile and it grows a diversity of crops. I don't have a good answer for you there. But one of the things that I think is really, that one of the alliances, it's kind of an amazing alliance, that needs to be broken, and I'm not sure how it's going to be broken, but a large part of our farm bill, this massive set of laws, is in the nutrition title. And I was describing this to Gabrielle yesterday or so. The second largest is the subsidies that go to helping keep these farmers doing exactly what they're doing, growing monoculture after monoculture of corn and soybeans. But the biggest portion is the nutrition title. What is the nutrition title? A large part of that is what we call SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. It used to be called food stamps. Now there's an alliance between the hunger advocates and the subsidy lobby, because both are benefiting from each other. So whenever there's a threat that subsidies are going to be cut, then the hunger lobby goes to work. Whenever SNAP benefits are going to be cut, the big-time big ag goes into motion. So one of the things that I think would be really great, and I say it at any opportunity I get, and I get criticized for it quite a bit, is that we need to have a nutrition standard for the supplemental nutrition, there's the word, assistance program. But there isn't. You can buy any food you want. Food sometimes in quotes, because you can buy Coca-Cola, corn, okay, and a lot of processed food. Soybeans is the major source of added fat to the American diet. So if we change that policy so that there was a nutrient density standard for that supplemental nutrition assistance program, I think that would start to change the picture, because then it would be law. And then maybe the hunger advocates don't really want to support the subsidies and vice versa, but they do it because it's been a historic link. And I think that a lot of our nutrition assistance program started out as an agricultural support program. And the fact that we were feeding people with the food was kind of secondary. Yeah, but it's an excellent point. I don't really have good answers for you. Another was that what I showed, though, about the insurance companies. If they really get serious about not wanting to pay for this horrible healthcare problem we have, then they might start demanding changes in how we cost our food. The cheapest foods are the least nutritious, and it shouldn't be that way.
Thanks, Jennifer. That was a very interesting talk. Very depressing, I'm afraid.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. We have to face reality. I see a convergence of factors here. I'm particularly interested in the developments from peak oil, which really ought to be called peak cheap oil. And that's a vital feedstock into agriculture, as we know. And I went to a lecture the other night by Julian Cribb. He's a local researcher and scientist. He gave two interesting statistics. One was a statement, really, that the supermarket system is destroying agriculture, destroying farming. It's an alarming prospect. How do we break that nexus? And the other factor was that the number of cars in the world is growing at 7% per annum. The supply of oil is growing at 0.7% per annum. So that's a doubling in 100 years, whereas the cars are doubling every 10. Do you see, just from the US, where you're most familiar, is there any sense of convergence here that the potential emergency caused by peak cheap oil is beginning to weigh on policymakers' decisions, or is it really up to the lobbies yet?
Well, I have been aware of a few strategies, a few policy changes, a few initiatives in cities to ramp up public transport. And there are more and more people that are biking in areas that are suitable for that. But I don't know that there's that much convergence. I mean, I'm sensing more here, just in the week or so I've been here, than really in the U.S. And it's difficult to, I mean, the national public leaders don't speak as clearly as I've heard people speak here about the need to really change energy consumption. We definitely have energy conserving programs, and more and more cars on the market that are fuel efficient, but I have my doubts as to whether that really, I mean, people just use them more because they're efficient. But yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be fundamental change. It's either going to be voluntary and somewhat pleasurable to make these changes, or it's going to be pretty painful. But it's going to be sort of over a long period of time. There's not really convergence in the U.S. entirely over whether climate change is real. And so if we can't even get there, I mean, that's really frightening, I think, that we can't really agree that there's a problem and we can't agree what to do about it. And part of the problem there, I think, is that people recognize that in some ways it's too late. And so why change? But I'm sitting here from the United States, and it's the U.S. that needs to change the most. And so on behalf of the United States, I apologize that we're not doing that. Because it's really shameful. You know, but on a personal level, you know, people do make change. My husband and I don't own a car. I think I've told a few in the room that. We haven't had a car for 4 years. We belong to a car share program that's in my city. You don't have a car share program in Canberra. It's something that I think could really work here. So those kinds of things really make a huge difference. There's 20 cars in the car share program that meet the needs of 1,500 people. So you drive less when you do that, and it changes your life, but life is going to change. The other thing, just to raise something that's very controversial, I'm sure, is that, you know, people need more than food, and every human that comes on the planet is going to need food for a lifetime, but also is going to want to drive cars, also is going to want to do international travel, also is going to want a house, also is going to want flat screen TVs or all of that. So every human has a huge impact. So on our bike ride the other morning, and Gabriel said don't mention this, but I'm going to, there was a sign that says, go home and have sex. And I understand that there's a child bonus or something that you have to get in before the deadline. So it was kind of, I was incredulous that people are, in this time when the global demand that humans are making on the planet is so obvious that that is something that's happening. So I think that's one of the critical things too. Think about how we're more than replacing ourselves.
Also for very interesting presentation. My question is about peak phosphorus.
Peak phosphorus, okay.
Yeah, so we're just starting to talk about that in Australia, and I'm just curious about the US experience. So I understand that it's estimated that in 2035 we're going to reach peak phosphorus, like peak oil, except different time frame. So I'm just curious, is there anything talked about this in the States?
Well, it's basically in various groups that have to do with conservation and have to do with sustainable agriculture. And I think one of the major critical projects that we need to undertake in a big way is building soil fertility and making friends with the billions and billions of microbes that make up the community that's in the soil. And yeah, I don't really have a good sense of what the debate around that is.
Well, thank you for this interesting presentation. The message that I get from this talk is produce locally and eat locally. What happens when political parties do exactly the opposite? I have a case on which I have written a paper very recently, where the political party said that we will give you rice, this is a story from India, at a subsidized price, 90% subsidy. All right. So the farmers stopped producing millets and pulses, which were nutrition rich, and went for eating rice, which was nutritionally low. Mm-hmm. And there were other devastating consequences of that, was that the fodder that was available from that millets production was no longer available. So animals did not have anything to eat. So the animals had to be sold. So milk was not available within the family to feed the kids. So the nutritional levels went down significantly. Now here comes the NGO and tries to change the mindset of the people, telling them that it is better for you to work harder than to buy subsidized rice. And this, the clientele is the tribal people. And it successfully changed the mindset of the people and made them cultivate the traditional crops.
Mm-hmm.
And the result after 5 years is that those 75 villages where the NGO is working is like an oasis in a desert, where the rest of the state is reeling under a drought, while these 75 villages are having food security, water security, health, education, everything that they are after. But what is interesting is, it was the political party and the government which came to power on this slogan of subsidized rice, 90% subsidy, which was the real culprit for this disaster. Now, how do you handle that kind of a situation for your message? Grow, produce locally, and consume locally.
So the subsidized rice was coming from where?
Sorry?
Where was the subsidized rice coming from?
Well, the subsidized rice was coming from the rest of the country.
Ah.
So basically the government was buying the rice
Uh-huh.
and providing money out of the exchequer, right, to buy the rice and
Right.
provide the rice to the tribals at a subsidy of nearly 90%, so almost free. The rice was almost free. And another
And so
important-
what was the motivation to grow it locally? Is
Yeah,
what
well,
you're saying?
eventually, this story is from the state of Andhra Pradesh,
Mhm.
where the NGO is working. And that's the state which has seen the largest number of farmer suicides. The rest of the state, right? Because of this policy of subsidized rice.
Right.
And the main folk who were doing the farming and the cultivation of the millets and pulses, which was a hard labor,
Yeah.
were having a lot of free time because of, subsidized rice. And how do you kill the free time? Drinking alcohol.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of those policies are not motivated by a concern really for health and well-being. They're motivated by agricultural production economics. And we do a lot of that in the United States. We subsidize heavily the production of corn, soybeans, wheat, other commodities, to the point that we can then provide them on the international market at such a reduced price that it really creates food insecurity in places because of the exact same thing that you're talking about. So I think the question is, how do you create political will? I mean, how do you create an awareness and a caring and a consciousness and a courage among national leaders that are setting those policies? How do you do that? I don't know. I don't know. But we call it, it's dumping. We dump these commodities on other countries, and it's really, it's unconscionable to do that. And out of a stated interest in helping the poor and feeding the hungry. And perhaps it does some of that, but I think it oftentimes disrupts the local agricultural system.
Thank you, Jennifer. You're a dietitian, right?
Yes.
Yeah, look, it's really great to hear such good sense coming from a dietitian because it's pretty rare.
Thank you. Yeah,
Well,
there was many years that I didn't even want to say I was a dietitian, but now I do.
Yeah. Well, you seldom hear dietitians relating the food to where it actually comes from.
Yeah.
But that wasn't my question. My question was, are you aware, I'm looking at the MDB Futures banner over here, and I'm wondering how much you're aware of the process of the Murray-Darling Basin Plan that we've been, that has appeared a few years ago. The first version appeared a couple of years ago. Do you know anything about it? Because talking about food
Just
miles...
very little.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
it was so ironic to me that
Yeah.
you were talking about food miles when in Australia we actually had, some political will to do something about that. And the plan, I think we're about to see the final version, and to use a very bad pun, I think it's going to be totally watered down. And it's not going to be anywhere near as powerful as it could have been. But it actually, that plan was, to a certain extent, addressing the problem of food miles. We're so dependent on this irrigation area out west. You know, food is trucked hundreds, if not thousands of kilometres backwards and forwards in this country, in those sort of systems, but particularly in New South Wales and Victoria and South Australia. But unfortunately, the interests that benefit from that system continuing have pretty much scotched the, well, I won't say, I'm sure some good stuff's going to come out of it still, but it didn't go down very well at all, the recommendations.
But the recommendations are there. They need to be just put forward again and again and again. I mean, just think about a lot of food marketing. The advertisers know that they can't just show an advertisement once and that consumers are going to buy their food products, right? They see them all the time, over and over again.
Yeah, but that costs money. I mean,
I know.
The problem is it's us volunteers.
Yeah,
people doing,
I know. We don't have their money, do we?
And we work really hard at it, but you're up against people who do have money, who, buy the expensive TV ads.
Right.
But anyway, look, I fully support everything.
Well, it sounds like an excellent endeavour, and I hope that the next time it's put forward, maybe it'll have a little more teeth to it, which is what you're hoping, I think. All right. Well, thank you very much for your questions and for being here.
I'd just like to say thank you to Jennifer for being here tonight and for throwing out so many different questions and challenges for our current food system, and also looking at the possible benefits of local food systems from not just an economic point of view, but also from those social and environmental perspectives as well. So I think we've all learnt a great deal about, I was really interested in a lot of those nutritional profiles as well, because in Australia, there's of course the bush tucker that are very high in nutrient and phytochemicals as well. So that was a really interesting aspect of what you were having to say tonight. So, and I also thought she handled the glitches in our presentation extremely well. She didn't get phased at all. So congratulations and thank you very much. And it's been an absolute pleasure having Jennifer here for the last week and also over the time for the Dietitians Conference. So it's been a real joy for all of us. And so thank you very, very much.